Well, good morning and welcome, folks. Today is a show. I'm starting without my fancy intro, my graphics that go by usually with my badass picture with my hat that makes me look real cool and everything, because I want to jump right in. I want to talk about something that's very important to me, as every day I say that. Most topics are. But the reason that I say this is very important to me, when I say that, that should be a sign to you, usually those folks who watch me or listen to me, is I'm about to learn something. Like there's something where I have burning questions about it. I don't know enough about it, and I tap into people who I know for sure could help me learn and understand. Today, that thing is the canon, and how we teach and think about literature, and how we deal with the science of reading and reading in general or whatnot. I don't want to go too far down that pipe, but I just do want to say that growing up, I was a great reader. I was really good at it. I was like a great reader. It wasn't my identity as a student, but what my school and my teacher didn't know was that I used to hide in libraries and just read and read and read whatever I wanted, though. And I did very poorly in school because I hated with the capital H what we were reading and studying in school, but loved with the capital L what I was reading in the libraries on my own, and became a very good reader. And I learned a lot from it, and worlds were opened up to me from the stuff that I read. If you've been watching this show for any amount of time, some of you know, biggest, deepest, darkest secret of Chris Stewart, the badass on Twitter, was the first book that I read cover to cover was Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Very weird first book to read. Now that couldn't have been more different than my life. But I learned so much by walking through the eyes of someone else, the main character of that book or whatnot. I don't know what's so wrong with that. But my guest today, educator, English kind of all-star, person who actually online tweets a lot under the disrupted texts hashtag. Not what she started, but what she participates in with educators across the country who are definitely thinking critically about the text that we put before kids, the things that we allow kids to read, to learn. It's Hope Teague-Bowling. Good morning. Thank you so much.
Good morning.
Morning where you are, right?
No, it's evening here in Abu Dhabi.
Yes. So Hope is expat right now. I think that's what they call it. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. That's correct. Yeah.
I don't know if you call it that if you're temporary, but she's out of the country. So welcome back into the country and into our discussions. Thanks. How you doing?
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
So I mentioned disrupted text, and I don't want to go there, immediately deep on what the project of disrupted text is, but I do want to just kind of like give some framing to the it feels like there's an argument or there's a debate online, and it feels like it's one of those
Always.
things right, and honestly, outside of education, though, if you're not a teacher and an educator, you don't always know that there are these serious disagreements between educators. It happens in math, like serious disagreements about how you teach math. It happens in social studies. We're seeing that nationally right now, and it happens in English and in literature and ELA, right? And we don't always know that. So what's the dispute? Can you give us just a frame of the discussion, and what's that issue? What's the dispute?
Well, it's funny because as I was thinking about some different things to talk about today, I was looking back to like when the conversation about the canon first started. And I remember having these conversations back in undergrad, and then just how they progressed or how they've shifted and changed a little bit with time. And so really, I suppose to try to sum up the dispute, essentially folks are arguing that we have these canonical texts that have, they're tried and true. They offer literary merit, which we can unpack what literary merit means later. And we must teach these same books over and over and over and over again in high school. Specifically. But on the other hand, there's, a large contingency of folks who are making the argument that, okay, great, literary merit, if we have these qualifications and these elements that we consider making a piece of literature a good piece of literature, there's so many writers today and writers in the past that we never acknowledged that actually fit these qualifications. So I think that would kind of sum up those pieces.
So when you say literary merit, and you said we'll get there later. Nah, man, let's jump in there right now. What is? Okay, I've always wondered how people how does somebody else outside of me how have they
Define.
decided what should be in the canon?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we have to maybe just state the unstated, which is the folks who were in power who made the decision to create these categories were definitely white and male. So there were certain things that they were bringing to the table. But I'm actually an AP Lit and language teacher. And so one of the things that I think about when I think about literary merit is a text that you can look at something in terms of structure, content, style, and mechanics. So those 4 categories usually what people use to define something that has literary merit. And so within that, you might unpack, how is a text structured? I don't want to get too nerdy on the audience here. What is a text including in it? What's the content of it? If you think stylistically, it's everything from vocabulary, figurative language. There's a whole bunch of stuff that fits under style, tone, mood, all that stuff. And then, of course, mechanics is, are they doing something interesting or unique within the genre, either deviating from the genre or reinforcing it?
Okay, so by what you just gave as a criteria, I could, and I'm asking this as a question, maybe it's rhetoric, but maybe it's a question. Theoretically, a Wu-Tang album of lyrics could fit that definition.
Yes. Well, and this is why the debate is also stupid. It's a stupid debate. Like, we're creating something instead of looking at these different genres of literature and art and text. And one of the things that I've changed in my practice is just using the frame text, right? So talking about any kind of text. Anything can be a text. Can you analyze it? Can you engage in it? It could be art. It could be music. It could be a poem. It could be a novella, whatever it may be. Can you analyze it? Did the author do something when they were creating it? What did they bring to the table when they were producing it and creating it? And so if you have that framework, right, everything can be analyzed. I mean, I can't tell you some of the I've worked in a lot of different schools, and there's been a lot of things that I would have never have thought I would have analyzed, but you can break it apart. You can analyze structure, content, mechanics, all those pieces.
So what I have seen and heard on the other side, and I've been watching this on Twitter and the tweets, so I'm learning actually just from what their gut instinct are as educators to say what the problem is. So I've seen a couple, like one, I can't remember this guy's last name. I only remember his first name because I have a son named Soren. So his name is Soren. He's from Germany. He had a quick clip here that said, listen, I grew up in Germany, and we reread all of the best of what has been written for all of times. Why would we deny kids that? And then he named 4 or 5 white authors in a row. We read white author 1, white author 2, white author 3, 4, 5. And I thought to myself, okay, so you just told me that you read all of the best that has ever been written or said in history, and you just named 5 people that come from your heritage or your background, your culture, and you're kind of decentering their heritage or their culture by pretending they're universal. Isn't that exactly part of the problem?
Yeah, 100% that's part of the problem. And I think in particular, I am seeing it from white folks, if I'm going to be honest. Those tend to be the folks who push a certain narrative around certain texts and really hold to what they might consider a traditional canon. But even if you think about change with time, part of why we paid attention to these books in the past is because the folks who wrote them had access to printing, to power, to elements of society that other folks did not have access to. And so I think we would be remiss if we didn't pay attention to that, whether we want to talk about female writers who pretended to be male under their pen name so that they could get published, folks of color who were writing, but no one wanted to pay attention to them or didn't have access to some of the levers of power in that particular time frame. I mean, there's a number of ways we could look at it, but there's a reason why those people became part of the canon, those writers, and it really didn't have to do with the fact that, I'll put it out there, maybe it's controversial, but I don't think it really had to do with the fact that their writing was that much more amazing than somebody else's.
Okay, so help me out, do tell. What was a woman author that wrote as a man?
Oh my gosh, George Eliot comes to mind.
George Eliot is a female, really, a woman writer.
Yeah, in the UK. Yep. She had to be published as a male because nobody cared about her and her stories as a woman. And then also there's elements of like, what were people writing about? People write about what they're interested in. People write about what's going on in society around them. And so if you're writing about something that you think nobody else in that society or community cares about, well, there's also that element of how do you market it? How do you get your writing out there? Yeah. So George Eliot's one of the famous writers in that boat.
On the universality thing, like, this literature that we're talking about, it's universal. It's not just that these were dead white guys. You just mentioned something to me on gender. So do you think that the literature that is considered part of the canon that has so much of this what's considered to be great writing, but all the women characters were written by men. Is that detectable? Is there anything discernible about that? Is there any problem with that? Or is that, I mean, I'm thinking of Shakespeare. He's my go-to on my whipping boy because I hated Shakespeare all my life.
Wait, what's your least favorite play?
I think all of them, but I think in high school we had to do like the Merchant of Venice or we had to and I actually remember thinking, you know, shekels and fish and all these things, and it was like I remember thinking to myself, this has no relevance to me whatsoever. I hate this. This is like a daily grind of almost like reading Greek in some way. It's almost like many years ago I switched from the King James version of the Bible to the Good News Bible.
Yeah.
And you know, I was going to go to hell for that. I was going to go to hell for switching to the Good News Bible. I was like, I'm not going to go to hell if I can understand the passages better, like without all the thou shouts and the thou arts and all that type of stuff. But it's a good question you ask. Which of the Shakespeare? I'm trying to remember all the ones that that were mandatory, and maybe
Romeo and Juliet.
I hated Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah,
but we didn't have to read that. We actually had to do that in theater. We had to do it. We didn't actually have to read it, and the script to me was horrible. Hated it. Macbeth had some. I mean, there was some gangster stuff in Macbeth that felt relevant.
That's actually my favorite Shakespeare play to teach, is Macbeth, because it's just everything, right? Evil people, and really not even evil people, just folks who are wrestling with good and bad, and there's just so many entry points for Macbeth.
Yeah, I think Merchant of Venice was the one that made me say, I'm done. This is over with. I'm not doing this anymore. Like, we're not going to do this. But my question really around that was, it doesn't feel like, to the other side's opinion, the fact that a male wrote all these great plays and wrote the female characters of the time, and male actors were playing women roles of the time, doesn't feel like it had any type of imprint. Like it wasn't a problem. It still came out as great.
Yeah, I think just because something is common practice doesn't mean that it's not a problem. And I think part of, you know, as we change, as we grow as a society, as we understand things better, we have to be retrospective and look back at our work and be critical about the time and the place that we're in now. And I think there's some things we allowed in the past because, you know, it was what it was, and that's just how it was. But that doesn't mean we have to continue to do those things today. So one of the things that's kind of part of this conversation, I would argue, is own voices literature. And so that kind of deals with what you're bringing up here. So can I write a book with a teenage boy protagonist and do an okay job? Maybe. I've been in education for 15 years. I can have a reader for authenticity read. There's some things I can do with that for sure. But there's something to be said about having a person who comes from that point of view, that experience, who's offering insight. They're going to see things a little bit differently than someone outside is going to see. I've read many a book with, you know, female protagonists, and it's fine. But there's definitely books you can feel when it's very, very forced, one-dimensional, and so on. So I think part of this conversation is it's not a either or, it's a both and. And so I just wanted to throw that on the table as well.
Even if it's okay, like if the story comes out great, it still doesn't preclude you from still saying, yeah, but you should have women writers still, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about a conversation I had with S.K. Ali, who's the writer of From A to Z, which is a book told by a Muslim American writer about Muslim American kids and teens. And so that was part of the conversation we had, is like, she's just one representation of that. And so it's important to have her voice on the table, but also know that that's just one representation. At the same time, you know, one of the things we discussed was that piece of like, it would be to normalize daily experiences of Muslims and the vast variety of Muslim experience. You need to have more Muslim characters. And so you need more people writing about that. Not everyone's going to be writing about that. So just kind of that tension in terms of, you know, representation. What does that look like?
You know, going through the disrupted text or disrupt text, I should get it right. So for people looking, their hashtag is disrupt text. They also have a website you can find. It's disrupttext.org. I'd say go straight to their mission statement so that you can get kind of a grounding of what it is and what it's not. Because there might be some confusion about what it is and what it's not. There are several points in their mission statement, but one I gravitated right away to. We believe that no curricular and instructional decision is a neutral one. For too long, the traditional canon in quotes, at all grade levels, has excluded the voices and rich literary legacies of communities of color. This exclusion hurts all students and especially students of color. Do you buy into the idea that that any decision you make around what's going to be in the canon or what you're going to teach is not neutral, that it all is, I don't know what you would say it is. Is it political or is it cultural or is it social?
100%. And actually, that's one of my favorite parts of their mission statement. And I think that when I started being exposed to their work, again, Tricia Ebarvia, Lorena Germain, Dr. Kimberly Parker, and Julia Torres, they're the foundation of Disrupt Text. And they put together all, this mission that I think captured so much of some of these subtle conversations that were happening across the country. But that line in particular, right? Every decision that you make has a consequence and has a repercussion. So the question becomes for teachers, what is that decision that you're going to make? And then are you okay with those consequences? Are you okay with whatever the outcome comes from that decision in that moment? And that could be everything from the text you choose to that instructional strategy you use in that particular moment. So I'm actually very passionate about this issue. I'll hold myself back there.
But why are you though? I mean, what would animate you around this? Did you feel like there was some mandate or some push to make you actually see the canon as a real reductive, minimalist set of texts?
Well, I think for me and kind of my journey as a language arts teacher, I'm kind of torn between kind of two ideologies. So on the one hand, I think about how teaching canonical texts, whether it's Catcher in the Rye or whatever, Lord of the Flies, we can talk about those later. There's something to be said about, okay, we have these texts, their access to PowerPoints, right? I want my students to be able to have conversations at college level, to be able to access these things, to have, like the cultural background when it comes to certain things like Romeo and Juliet, for example. So on the one hand, there's a huge move. And part of what I grew up in that tradition as a teacher, is around teaching these texts critically. Right. So interrogating why the author wrote the way they wrote, how it reflects the community society, why they wrote flat women in their stories, why they weren't more dynamic, why we don't even hear this woman's voice, why this person of color doesn't even have a name in the story. Right. So I think there's so much to be done around that kind of teaching. And I have often, in my practice, that's kind of the lens I've taken. Right. So how do I teach Hamlet in a more, feminist manner, so to speak? Or how do I teach Macbeth with a different lens? At the same time, I wrestle with just like blowing it all up and saying, well, why are we even teaching this to begin with? Gatsby, do we really need to be teaching Gatsby in high school? Another side.
Answer that part. Do we need, what would be different about my child's life if he did not read The Great Gatsby?
Yeah. I actually think sometimes we force kids in high school to read texts that they would be better suited as adults. And maybe that's just my own experience and some of the people that I hang out with. But I didn't read Gatsby until I was a junior in college and I took a 20th century American lit class. And then I had to read, and I was really averse to it because I really did not like American literature. And then I had a New Zealander in the UK showing me a whole new world, which again goes back to who's teaching you, why are they teaching you, how are they teaching you? So, part of me just thinks, why are we even doing this to begin with? But that goes back to that point from Disrupt Text. Every single decision that you make has a consequence or has something that comes from it. And so what do you want to come from it? Is this really about representation? Is it about, a time capsule, so to speak? I don't know if you've ever watched the show Mad Men, but that comes to mind because I was so mad when I first started watching Mad Men. It's a, classic show that white people love. So when I first started watching, I was like so angry about it because I just couldn't believe how like misogynistic it was and racist and all these things. And then as I started watching it, I started to realize, wait a second, this is like a piece of literature, and the way that things are layered, it's actually a reflection of society in that moment. So if you view something in that way, I think you can have some really interesting conversations. You can develop your critical thinking, which is, I think in the end, what our jobs as teachers are. Like what it is to help kids become more critical thinkers. It's not to force a particular ideology on them or to say this is a good text or this is a good text, but to help them wrestle with what makes a good text, what makes a meaningful piece of literature that, lasts all of time, or comes back over and over again. And so I kind of wrestle with that, right? So there's the leverage piece, and I think you can like subvert the status quo in how you teach these more traditional type texts. On the other hand, they're going to stay mediocre and they're going to stay at the forefront of the conversation unless we revisit what that looks like. So I think a number of years ago, the College Board started using folks like Toni Morrison, right, included in their text, and that has become canon, which I'm like, great, because the first time it was not part of the conversation. So how do we get more writers, more female writers, more LGBTQ plus writers, more writers of color to be accepted as canon? And part of that is changing the conversation. We have to say, well, what is, if we're going with literary merit, what is literary merit? And then how do these texts line up to it? There's been some pushback around. I don't know if you were familiar with the book Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So some folks are like, teach Born a Crime instead of teaching these 5 other texts that we tend to teach in high school. I've seen some people suggest it as replacements for Catcher in the Rye. I've seen some people use it as replacements for To Kill a Mockingbird. But I think there's so many books out there that you can look side by side. And at first, folks might be inclined to, not want to give Trevor Noah the time of day. He's young. He doesn't really know what he's doing. It's like nonfiction. It's just a memoir, but
and it's not considered literature for a lot of people. It's considered, pop culture in some ways. Even though it's not, I mean, it would be considered like it's too of the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so even having that conversation with students, what does it mean to have a text that's too of the moment? And so how do we, wrestle with that? At the same time, would we get out from it? And then also, are we going to be looking back, 20 years from now, like, I can't believe we had this conversation that Trevor Noah's book was not literary enough. And having this is my second year teaching it to grade 10s. And I'll tell you what, I mean, there's just so much that he's doing as an author. Like every Common Core standard you want to slap on there, like, it's very relevant. It's filled with literary devices. It's filled with interesting structural choices, flashbacks, memories, description, pick your thing. It's actually in there. It's just really, what are you looking for? And I would argue that we have plenty of writers like that today. I mean, I even think about Jason Reynolds' work and Kwame Alexander. I mean, they're writing such beautiful stories that pull you in with the language and the choices that they're making as writers. Like, how is their writing not as qualified as like Salinger's? And it really goes back into the thing around bias, right? Whether it's bias because it's too new, is it bias because of race? Right? Is it bias because of class? I think there's part of this conversation also is very classist, right? Races and classes for sure.
I mean, it feels like no matter what you propose, that the real problem isn't that you're proposing something of merit or not merit. You're proposing something that takes away from the established white normed world. And what I see are a lot of white people and what I affectionately call Negropeans who themselves had such a revelatory experience when they read something, blah, blah, blah. And they can't possibly understand that there is nothing written in the history of mankind more devastating than the biography of Assata Shakur, for instance. Read that book and tell me you get halfway into that book and not feel like something that's real, like earth shattering. Real, not BS, not some thou art and all this type nonsense. So I always feel like, and this is just me being flippant and being Chris Stewart and being Chris Stewart flippant, which is, I always feel like, honey, if you had such a great time with that book, great. I love you. I love you for that. That's amazing that you got something, you learned about something that was so kind of universal and blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you for a fact that to be included is an insult, to be balanced by adding me into your white normed world. Let me go further than you, Hope, and then ask you to pull me back, because I do this sometimes. So I'm going to go further than you. If the big white lie was a historical colonization of people globally that had an intelligent design, had thought through its methods, and had thought through its tools and its tactics to make people of color globally subservient, a process that I called niggerization, but other people call it a variety of other things. And it just happened like science everywhere. One of those things was education, and it was replacing people's gods, replacing their religions, replacing their cultures, replacing everything with a white normed universal. So almost anything even that you do through disrupt text is like pulling the knife out 6 inches if you leave some of that other stuff in, right? Because what I think a lot of that other stuff is clever, artful marketing for white norm world. So leaving it in is a problem for me. And you guys are not saying we need to ban anything or take anything out. You guys are saying we just need to balance it, right?
Yeah,
so I
for
went
sure.
further than you would go. So help me, pull me off the ledge here.
So I'm definitely not going to speak for the organizers of Disrupt Text. From what I understand, it's very it goes down to being critical about the choices that you make and being reflective of it, right? There are certain things in our communities where we teach where our hands are a bit more tied than others, and it really depends on what district you're teaching in. So I do want to be clear about that. I think what you propose is something that I wrestle with in my own practice. When do I just get rid of it because it is just a tool of white supremacy? And when do I say, hey, let's talk about this tool? And then I don't know. I think in some parts, like as I mentioned a little while ago, I think you can, flip things around and then, look at it in a new way. But I guess to what end? Which goes back to being intentional about every single choice that you make, whether it's about the book that you're reading, an article that you're using in class, an instructional tool that you saw on Twitter, whatever it may be.
There's an idea that I've heard the question more than once: why would we rob kids of some of the richness that are in these texts already? Like, why would we rob them of the opportunity to see the glory of this? Is that realistic when you think about the statistic that always burns in my head, the number of people that never read a book again, a full book again, once they leave high school? Like the number of Americans that never read an entire book again is so big.
People love to use that. Like, I'm not going to admit all the books I never read in high school until I got to college or still have not read as a language arts teacher. That's my own, shame to wrestle with. But like you said, you can live a wonderful, fulfilled life. You can be a thoughtful, critical, reflective person. You can be engaged in, justice work and not have read a lot of things. And so I guess it comes down to, what do you want to spend your time on? And then what do you actually, how are you actually moving your thinking forward? So I actually want to go back to one of the things you had brought up, just thinking about people who resist change in the first place. I think part of it, like you said, there are folks who are they want to teach the same book over and over because they had a revolutionary moment with that text. Mm-hmm. And so that's awesome. Like you said, it's so great, fabulous. But the kids in front of you might not need that same moment that you needed with that book. And that book might not be the book to do that for them. And so you have to, as a teacher, really think about what is the book for them. I mean, I feel like there's quite a bit of pressure here because, you're like a couple of books a year. And like you said, people don't read after high school. And so you're like, biggest bang for your buck. Yeah. But I think that's part of it, right? Teachers are afraid. I think a lot of this stems from fear, right? So teachers either had a good experience themselves. They want some other kid to have it, even though the kid doesn't have any kind of similar life experience to their own. They're afraid to change. They know how to teach this book. They've taught it a long time. They know all the pages and all the cute literary devices to talk about. There's also fear of if they do something different and say they want to do something more transformative or something unique or interesting or different, they're afraid because what if they do it wrong? And I think that has to be said as well. Like there are a lot of teachers, and myself included, where I was nervous about teaching a given text because I thought, can I even do this text justice? Can I even talk about these things in this book in a way that is respectful, honoring, that's centering the author, that's not bringing in my own like white lens and my own white supremacy that's, in who I am and my, my life experience. And so I think that's another part of this is people are afraid of that. Maybe some people even lack skills, right? They don't have the skills necessarily to approach a book in a particular kind of way that's useful for the students in front of them. So I think a lot of teachers are wrestling with these different personal things as well as in the choices that they're making for their classroom.
One of the tenets that I read in the mission statement there was around is, one thing to be culturally responsive in your teaching. It's another to be specifically anti-racist in your teaching. I just heard some of the methodology that you use when you help kids walk through some of these texts critically and you help them think critically about them, even if you're teaching some of the white-centric canonical ones that are celebrated. Can you really be anti-racist, though, if you are still kind of acting as a delivery system for the marketing? And that's what I'm calling the canon. The canon is marketing for white supremacy in my mind. Yeah. Can you really be anti-racist? And if you can, how are you helping people deconstruct that? Are you telling them explicitly this is a marketing system for white supremacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that captured last year. I taught Hamlet, and then I also interviewed Trisha Barvia from Disrupt Text, one of the organizers and the creators, founders. And that was in my conversation with her. I felt more and more convicted as we were talking that I just need to find a different play. Right. And there's, again, tons and tons of plays out there written by amazing writers. But I think sometimes, we go with what's easy. We go with what can I Google? What's a PDF that's already on someone else's website that I can access easily, especially if you're in a school district that has no money to make those changes. And I think that's the other piece here. A lot of folks do want to do better in their practice and bring in more inclusive text and more representation in the books that they're having students read, but there's no money to support it. And so then they start a GoFundMe. They're hustling. Like, I cannot tell you how many times I had to hustle on the internet to try to get access to books through, like amazing organizers like in my city. Like, I think back when I first started teaching Citizen by Claudia Rankine, I had read it through a book club, and a few of my friends were like, okay, great, we'll give you our 5 books. And then I was like, how do I get a class set of these, and then I had, 3 sections of the class, but I'm like, just get me one class set, 30 books is all I need. And, we were partnered with our local bookstore. People were donating left and right. It was amazing, but it was also like, that's what you have to do every time you want to bring something new in. It's definitely a barrier to it. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's definitely a barrier, I think, to this change, to changing the way people look at literature and thinking about what they put in front of students.
Are you developing strong kind of like collegial relationships across districts or, across, geography of other people who are like-minded like you, and you can share and you can help each other? I mean, are there educators supporting each other on this?
Yes, I really do think so. I think that's one of the reasons I was drawn to the Disrupt Text work, is because, on Twitter, there's a space where we can share those things, and folks are like, here's a resource I have, here's a resource, people sending each other books, any of those kind of pieces. But sorry.
No problem. I got my coffee.
No water. I got talking too much. That's why. One of the other values from Disrupt Text is working in community. And I think that is essential. You have to work in community, because you cannot even be reflective about your own practice if you don't have anyone next to you who's like, hey, what you doing over there? Why you doing that? Why you doing that? Why you doing that? Every time you can answer, well, I'm doing because, and really get at the so what and the why of what you're doing, you need other people to help you do that. And I feel lucky, I've worked in some amazing public schools in the United States where I had people who we were on that journey together, right? And so I made some amazing teacher librarian friends who I was like, I want a book that does blank, and I have no idea where to start. And accessing your teacher librarians, folks, I cannot encourage people enough to do this. They're in that work, like they understand it. They're like, oh, I have this nuanced thing for a 6th grader. You're like, oh, okay. I would have taken me years to figure that out and how to look it up, And so partnering with folks constantly. And I think I'm lucky in the sense of I'm now in an international context, and this work is new, but there's still people who are interested in it. And so in an international context, it's a whole other, there's some other layers around like colonial mentality in addition to white supremacy. And so like colonial writing, and what does that mean in this space? And I've recently just been able to get plugged in with some other folks. There's a group called the Diversity Collaborative and a few other organizations who are starting to have these conversations, or maybe had them in pockets, but now are more collectively having those conversations. And so we can look back and really think about, what is this book that we've been teaching? If we have a lot of students from India, for example, do we have any Indian writers that we are like listening to, reading? Oh, we don't? Okay, let's talk about why we don't. And then, if we do, who are we bringing in? If this is the first novel that they've read from this point of view, who are we bringing in? And so those conversations are happening, which are pretty critical, I think.
You said a couple of very powerful things in there that resonate with me. The first one is the lifting up of librarians. When I tell you that in school, my identity wasn't a great student, but in libraries, I was king, librarians were much better teachers. I've said this for years. Libraries are the one thing my American government gets right. Way better than schools, way better than colleges, way better than voting systems or whatever else we have going on. I literally believe that the library system in the United States, bar none, I knew how to find the library I needed to go to, which one I could get equal access into it.
Yeah.
I didn't have to have an address. Whatever. I sat in university libraries, municipal libraries, state libraries. It was amazing. And librarians were were the amazing people in that, because you would ask a few questions or whatnot, and they would lead you to lead yourself to the right thing. So number one, thank you for lifting up librarians. Appreciate it.
They're amazing. They're amazing.
And with the example you just gave, like for educators to tap into them and say, like, I'm looking for a book that does X. I had a question, like, too. Do you think that there's anything, I'm making hay of like what's in the canon. You said whether it has merit or not, and there's a critical way of thinking that through. I don't, I'm not steeped in that, but do you think that anything that makes it into canonical status is actually really just trash? Have you as a teacher come across anything and went like, okay, like the other ones have merit, I just don't like them, but this one, literally, I don't know how it got through the cracks?
By the way, what you just brought up is huge, because there are folks who can't even recognize that what they don't like is different than what has literary merit, by the way. So some of the pushback I've heard around Born a Crime, even like Beloved, or there's a number of books where that, people don't have a stink eye towards something, and it's about personal opinion rather than actual merit. I would have to think about that a second to think of a title. I definitely, like I mentioned, that American Lit class I took, I was really not looking forward to reading Faulkner and Hemingway and everybody. And so I had to see it from a different point of view. Let me think about it before the end of this, and I'll see if I can think of one in particular that I think is more of a hot garbage.
Moby Dick.
Oh my gosh. I joke that Moby Dick is my Moby Dick. Like, I've tried to read that book 5 times, no joke. Probably closer to 10. And here's the thing. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do it. It's a great white story. It's a great story. Like, so many men I know really love that book for a variety of reasons, I guess. So many, it's like using all these literary illusions. I get all the illusions, right? I can, I get those. I'm like, I'm going to have to read it. I've tried listening to the audiobook on walks. I'm like, that didn't work. Okay, maybe if I go on a car ride. I once went on a car ride to go pick up peaches to do canning, which is a whole other thing. And I listened to that. I got to chapter 11. I was like, apparently it's not in a car ride. Okay, something else. I took it on vacation. I was like, at the beach. I'm like, maybe the beach will inspire me.
No.
I still haven't read it.
No. And that's my point exactly. Because somewhere walking around thought that was a great book that had triumph and revelations about manhood and,
Apparently, yeah.
And
I'm trying to get in there, but I just can't. I just want to, I want to be, accessing those revelations.
Educator Barnes, who's both an educator and a librarian, says, listen, Hope, you are not alone. I've yet to finish that book either. So I'm glad we're just telling the truth here for folks. Like, I would love anybody listening to in the comments, put a book that you think actually fits that description of everybody else thinks it should be in the canon and loves it, but for some reason you've never been able to figure out exactly why. Drop that in the comments there. There was a question from William Conrad, who asked, do you have feelings about a white-centric canon advocated by E.D. Hirsch and cultural literacy? What influence does he still have? And I don't know if you have a particular opinion about that. Do you have one?
Well, I have opinions about a lot of things, so let me dredge it up. It's been a while since I've thought about that, but it's from what I remember of it. It's the whole conversation of, are there certain cultural things that need to be shared, and we create the shared culture. And I think the older I get and the more I teach, that idea of shared culture is so like, how do I say it? It is such a narrow viewpoint. It's so myopic. So if you think about geography that has influenced culture and education and interactions and time and history, I mean, we add all these layers in, there really is not one superior culture. And white supremacy obviously says otherwise. And I think that book and some of that philosophy around that really is steeped in that. And I think that's beyond, some common social agreements. Like, you might say in a given country or in a given state, there's particular cultural norms. Okay, that's fine. The South has certain things that they're known for. The Northwest has passive progressiveness that they're known for, and recycling. So, but I don't think those are things that necessarily need to get passed on to kids. I do, obviously, as an English teacher, I do believe in the power of illusions, thinking about things in literature and culture. But I think even then, those things are very much encapsulated by a particular region or language, and space and time.
You mentioned earlier about, if I have Indian kids in my class, do I have any Indian writers in my group or that I'm going to teach?
Yeah.
How do you prevent like people who are going your direction on this, of thinking critically about the text that you deliver, of not tokenizing Black authors or brown authors just because they become like Toni Morrison, lover or hater or whatever? I'm not going to get into it. I'm just going to say it ends up on everybody's first list, her and Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I always just think about, now you're making another choice out of a rich world of kind of like Black literature, first of all, because Toni becomes your person. She becomes your go-to. And how do we avoid, when you said, now that you're outside of the country, you can see the global context. If I wanted to introduce my kids to the indigenous people in northern Mexico in their writing and their literature, and the Maori people of New Zealand, indigenous people all across the world, I'd have this rich group of people to live from, but if or to work with, but not if the first group of included texts that, you know, that become part of the inclusion movement are tokenized authors that are cause celebs for some reason. How do you prevent that from being the tactic?
Well, I think it's asking that question. So asking that question of yourself, asking that question of the text that you have in front of yourself or in front of you that you're trying to decide on using. And I honestly think being honest with students about it, and students, they want teachers to be transparent. You don't need to pretend like you know everything. You can get up in front of them and have those conversations with them. I think one of the things that I do, even before teaching Born a Crime, is say this is one story of one person's experience in South Africa at a given time. And so we actually start with a TED Talk by Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story, and come back to that over and over and over again. And I think as a teacher, you can say that, hey, we have this perspective. This is one person's perspective. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity for teachers not to tokenize. And that's if you actually look at your curriculum as a whole. So instead of just saying like, oh, we read one novel by a Black woman, great. Like, look at the other articles that you are reading. Look at the other texts that you're using. Look at the TED Talks that you've included. Look at whatever video footage. If you're using podcasts, who are the voices in the podcast that you are centering in your classroom? And then look at it's an entirety. And then I think you can get away from some of that tokenism if you're looking through and that's one of the things that I try to do it in the I can't say how many years that I've been working on this, but every year I'm like, how many more voices can I include this year that are not white, that are representing another place geographically or culturally or linguistically? And how can I include them in an authentic way that is not just tokenizing them? And every year I add like a couple more. It takes work for sure, but there are people out there doing this work. As you said earlier, we can get plugged into, whether it's your teacher librarian, folks on EduTwitter, folks in your other network. Like, I don't know about that one, a bit of a storm there, but Disrupt Tags, like go back through, and it's work, but you can do it, and it's what needs to be done. I think that's the other part of it. What needs to be done? We sometimes spend too much time doing work that's actually dumb work and a waste of our time, rather than work that's actually meaningful for students. To actually change something for them, and telling them, right? Like this year I taught Coates, Between the World and Me, and Citizen, Claudia Rankine. And again, we talked about both sides, right? So what are they representing? It's one perspective they're representing. That's one conversation that they're having. How do those texts talk to each other? How do they talk to the other things we read? Two different Black people, two different Black experiences. And that's just of the many, many Black experiences that are out there. And so making sure students are aware that that's, part of the conversation.
Would there be a problem with every family and every community deciding for themselves what their own canon was going to be and using it and forming their canons based upon their cultural heritage? Meaning, if I'm Mexican American, I don't need your canons. I need Mexican American canons, and we'll find everything that we need in our Mexican American or Mexican literary traditions that covers all the basis around love and humanity and trauma and triumph. We'll be able to find all of those things within our own. So I will send you a culturally confident and racially confident Mexican to your schools at some point, but I don't need you to introduce things that are going to make my kid use dual consciousness, have to see things through your world. Because we've done that for 150, 200, 300 years with the white consciousness. Like what we've fed white kids is a steady diet over multiple generations that tell them that they are the inventors of beauty. They're the inventors of art. They're the inventors of the 3-act play and the greatest devices of literature and you name it. So that's what we've taught multiple generations, and what we have by extension taught everybody else is
Mm-hmm.
You are a subplot in the main
Mm-hmm.
plot. And for me, the only way to reverse that feels like for there to be multiple canons. There should be a black canon. I can assemble enough black texts that teach our kids a universal experience of life and humanity through all black or blackish authors and
Yeah.
African related authors, and they will be just fine in my mind.
Mm.
But
Mm-hmm.
you're a
Mm-hmm.
teacher. Do you have any fears about that?
Well, I think that's kind of happening. Like some conversations are happening kind of in pockets around that. I don't know that it's made like more mainstream K-12, but it should. Like as you're talking, I'm thinking, ooh, I'm teaching AP Lit next year. That sounds like a really great culminating project. So I might cite you on my handout if I end up doing that. I love that idea. I think one of the things as you're sharing that I am reminded of, and it's part of the foundation of my own practice, is you probably have heard the conversation that books and literature are windows, mirrors, or sliding glass doors. So are you familiar with that phrasing?
Yeah. I don't know the sliding glass doors part. I know the windows and mirrors from Sharif El-Mekki, but what's the sliding glass door?
So Dr. I want to say Rudine Sims Bishop. So in about 1990 is when she started coining that phrase and referring to windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And so ultimately you have these windows where a book will help you see into a different world. And then part of her writing says, well, sometimes a window will reflect you. So then that window turns into a mirror. Do you see yourself in literature? Do you see yourself represented, whether that's your feminine self, your queer self, whatever it may be in that particular moment? And then sliding glass doors, she was talking about in this regard, it's opening and helping people kind of walk through a perspective that they've never had, not just as an observer through a window, but actually walking into that world. And I think about, fantasy and sci-fi and certain genres that really help students engage in a different world. But when I think about what you just described about having, a Black canon or a Native American canon or whatever it may be, one of the things I think about is how then do we make sure that students also are getting, whether they need, to me, that sounds like more like a mirror, which is completely important and necessary. And I wonder, what about the windows and sliding glass doors? And so in that work, that would be the only thing I think that I would want to make sure that is also coming up in my choice as a teacher, right? Or the choice with students and helping them. But maybe expanding on your idea would be, right, having students pick what is that text that is that window for you? What is that text that is a sliding glass door? And what are the texts that are mirrors for you?
So you could do it in the main, but you would still need some pieces of work that actually helped you see beyond yourself, your own yard, like your window, like to see into the broader universe. Feels like the way that White World has done that is through something that feels like confrontation theory, meaning like when you do have other characters, they literally are a subplot for one. And the way that you describe them is in your interactions with them. So like going into the dark continent becomes one of the way that you write literature years ago, right? Like, and go with me on my journey to Rhodesia, and maybe if you did that exact same thing with your window to the white world, explain them in this has been our interactions with them. This is what they brought to us. They brought us blankets with smallpox on them. I don't know if it has to be that negative.
Yeah, I mean, you could go there. Yeah. But I'm also thinking about, cross-cultural worlds, right? Cross-linguistic worlds. So having a class that, say, for example, you have some Arab students, right? They might be familiar with like texts by Arab writers, but that doesn't mean that other students in that classroom are. And so I think about that a little bit as well with the windows and the mirrors component. Is there another culture group linguist? I keep saying language as well because I think sometimes we disregard language groups as valuable in this conversation as well. And books written in languages that are not English. Part of that is my school is an IB school, and anyone listening who's familiar with IB program, that focus on globalization and like international conversations, there's so much amazing stuff there in the infrastructure of the IB program that what we're talking about actually could fit in perfectly if the teachers who are teaching it are using those things to help guide and make their choices with the books.
Here's a very American question.
Yeah.
Because in America, we like this versus that.
Of course.
Who's winning, in the battle debate. So I'm a lay person. I'm on the outside, and I'm a lay person. I'm thinking, I see disrupt text group of folks. I see, basically kind of save the canon people. And they're talking past each other. I can't figure out what's dominant between those two walks of thought. could you make some sort of estimate if you thought about the folks that are really trying to preserve what has existed for a long time, and let's just assume good intent, they have good reasons or whatever, and you have this other group of people who are saying, no, we need to deconstruct what we have been teaching and how we teach it or whatnot as educators? Is it equal? Or one of those dominant? Is there a small group of disrupt text people versus an institution? Are those people really feeling like they're under siege from all you hippies coming in the room trying to like, trying to liberalize everything?
I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes whatever your silo is, you're caught in that silo in your bubble. So you're like, I'm in the bubble. Everyone thinks that this is transformative and we're doing it. And then you're in another bubble and you're like, no, we all agree that we should all be reading Catcher in the Rye because hearing the angst of a 15-year-old white boy is what we really need in our lives. I think we're just too much in our silos to really fully know. But I to your point about everything being binary, I think folks want to like the minority of voices that are, not getting with 2020 times, or we're 2021. We're in 2021. I don't even know what year it is. Getting with the times. I think there's probably more. I would like to think that there's more folks on that journey of trying to bring better literature, interesting literature, more relevant text in. And maybe, as I said at the top of this, maybe for them, they're still in that beginning part of that journey where they're like, how can I teach Hamlet in a transformative way? Right. I've done that. I probably will continue to do that for certain texts, but also are we critically thinking about who actually has the same merit as Shakespeare and we should be giving time to and pay attention to and have our students exposed to as well, or have exposure around.
All right. So somebody I respect a lot, Miss Jasmine Lane, who is an educator here in Minnesota, who's very much more on the canon side and very much more, though, on the inclusive canon side. She's definitely not about like what I call Anglonesia, which is like you just do things out of like, kind of like Anglophilia, but you don't really know it and you don't pay attention to it. She's not that. So she's actually literally teaching a broad group of texts, but she still believes in the canon or a canon or the thought of one. And I go back and forth with her just on this other point. She said to me at some point, Chris, I just don't think you like literature. and it hit me that I like actually don't know what the description, because I like reading, I like texts and I like stories, but I don't know that when you start saying, does that rise to the level of literature? I don't know that it all does, maybe it does or doesn't, but I'm getting great meaning out of it. And then it hits me. Yeah. When you show Saving Private Ryan, the movie, in class, in school, which many schools do, that movie is a masterpiece in some ways. I don't know that you could write that book any better. I don't know that The Handmaid's Tale that I love on Hulu could be written as a book any better. And I honestly think the movie's better than the book most of the time. So as a teacher, what do you think? Can't we get as much meaning if delivering the same messages different ways? It might be a podcast, it might be a movie, it might be opera, it could be many things, but why do we need Catcher in the Rye, read on dry, dirty pages to be the thing?
We don't.
Ooh, finally, victory is mine.
Okay, so part of this conversation, another English teacher, shout out Jen Newton, we were talking about this, and part of this is rethinking genre as well. And so in the hierarchy of like what is a good text or what is literature, sometimes folks want it to look a particular way, right? So a novel or maybe a novella, but in fact we should be open to more genres, and I think that's what really you're getting at. So the graphic novel genre has really taken off in I don't know how many years, where not only are we getting graphic novel remakes of things like The Jungle, for example, right? Some kids cannot or do not want to read, I should say, not that they cannot, I do believe all kids can if they have support and whatnot, but maybe The Jungle in that fat version of it that we had to read in college is not the access point for a student today. What about using the graphic novel as a genre and using it as an entry point for students? So there's tons of writers right now who are producing amazing pieces of literature, I would argue, that fits all of these categories of literary merit that are writing in graphic novel form. And I think folks who, kind of poo-poo that style are really out of touch with what students need on the one hand, but also just whatever the ist is that it is when they're bringing that to the table. The same thing applies to young adult literature as well. There are fantastic books that have been, I'd think about some of the books I've read in the last 5 years that are in that young adult genre, that are just as amazing as any book written 50 years ago or 60 years ago, that you might say, oh, figurative language, whatever may be in there, that got you interested in that book to begin with. And so I think we need to expand our understanding of what a text is and what a rich text is that students can engage in. And like you said, podcasts, movies, there's a lot of things that could be part of it.
I know that Miss Jasmine Lane and others have talked about YA as being really problematic just because it's juvenile in its writing oftentimes, and it isn't at the same level. It's kind of dumbing down a little bit, but I don't know that they would say that every book that is under YA is that way or whatever. They just make a general, I think, kind of critique. I would like to say, as I have said here a million times, so my family who is watching this, my fam in the comments or whatnot, you guys have heard it a million times, so you're going to hear it from me one more time. The Matrix trilogy, it doesn't get any better than that. Every single literary device known to man and philosophy and religion and everything is in the Matrix trilogy. And it does a better job of making it real for the new millennium than the old religion does. So there you go. I'm going to say that. But, as we wrap, I want to ask you, what are you nerding out in this work on? Like, what excites you about it? What are the things that you think are most important about moving this debate forward and what it can mean for kids and for education? Like, what are you nerding out on the most?
Oh, gosh. I'm nerding out on a lot of things. I think just thinking about what this looks like for me now in the season of my life in an international school context. So my students, I work in a very diverse school in terms of racially and culturally. And in some cases, it is a different set of cultural and racial backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds than I've had in my previous experience. So I'm really excited right now about finding texts that resonate with them. And also, as we've talked about, looking at it in a different kind of way, maybe exploring new genres. I'm really excited about that right now. One thing I have been wrestling with is how to also make sure that the voices that we're including or the perspectives that we're including aren't just, as my friend she calls it the suffer parade. And so I think sometimes that is part of this. Like, I want my students to also have joy and see people of color experiencing joy in their lives through the text and living lives like everybody else. And that's actually a conversation I started to have recently with my students around Born a Crime, with the way that he talks seriously about apartheid and race relations and what it means to be a colored South African person. And at the same time, he's like, I'm a teenager. I like girls. I'm confused. I'm mad at my mom, but I love my mom. And so just that universal human experience, I think, is part of it. So I'm pretty excited about that and the challenge that presents. For those people who are listening who have recommendations, I'm revisiting my AP Lit curriculum this summer, and I'm really thinking about ways that I can apply all the things that we've been talking about. Like, should I be doing paired texts, right? Using Gatsby and A Raisin in the Sun together in conversation, or is Gatsby out the window? If he is, who am I replacing it with? If anyone wants to hit me up on Twitter with suggestions, I'd be happy for it as well. So I'm excited about that kind of work. I'm always open and looking to change and grow, not just for the sake of throwing something out. I don't think that's necessary, but for the betterment for our students, to help our students, like you said, find entry points in the text, engage in it critically and thoughtfully, and walk out of the classroom better thinkers, better writers, better readers.
I love this last point that you just made. I think that's where the real revolution is. You just hit on a part of the real revolution, which is
finally.
Well, no. I mean, so much of what you're saying, and I just want to give credit where credit is due. You and I have different opinions about a lot of things. I think I do that with everybody. I think so. It's not different. It's not unique to you, but I always draw and pull from people. So I see what you're saying. I get what you're saying in a lot of this, and I'm actually more on your side in this issue than I am on the kind of the conservative canon chat people's side, because I actually just believe in a world of open information. There's so much information in the world. Why couldn't we be teaching it all? But this thing around the suffer parade, I think that is the best description that I've ever heard. Number one, that is the best description. And number two about that is, if you take that to its next level, then you're really going to have to scour the earth for texts that come from people of color, marginalized people, globally marginalized people of all sorts. That isn't just about their struggle with colonialism, because I mean, you have colonialism, and then you decolonize and deconstruct, and then something comes after that.
Yes.
And that's the part we never get to. We never get to the promised land of what would happen if we weren't in the constant pattern of decolonizing and giving our kids what I call trauma porn. And I love Suffer Parade even better, because there is all this other range of human experience that we've had. That never gets so I think kids might be tired of reading of slavery stories if that's all they ever read about themselves, right?
There, the book Black Enough, and I always say Ezeboa's name poorly, so I'll acknowledge that. But that collection of stories by Black men and women across the spectrum of LGBTQ plus, like that text is phenomenal. And I felt like that was one of those books that really, like all the collection, not only pointed out like how vast and diverse the experience is, being Black in the United States, but also to your point, right? It really addressed a range of things, and there was a lot of joy in the midst of the other stories that were told.
Excellent. Well, thank you, number one, for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it. Come back anytime when you have something that you want to talk about. I want to further this discussion, want to keep it going. For number one, tell people where they can find you and what your various platforms that you have going on so that they can find you and hear from you.
I'm best found on Twitter at SPOnFire. So my name is Hope, and it translates in a lot of different languages, and one language is Spanish. And having traveled a lot of places, you can see SB Esperanza. So that's kind of related there. So SPOnFire and Twitter. And then also I have a podcast called Interchangeable White Ladies Podcast, and you can find us at IWL_podcast. I have a co-host. We're both educators, and we definitely come through things from an educator lens, but we try to have intersectional conversations. So we talk a lot about how awful white women are, but like how we can be better. And then also like all the different layers. We also try to bring on a lot of guests who are not white women to talk about the issues from their points of view and help us challenge our notions of the world. And as we say, to be less basic.
I love that. That is like one of the best titles I've ever heard in my entire life. And to be less basic. You're very good with branding. I appreciate that. Well, listen, I know you're in a different time zone, so this is your evening. Really appreciate you for making the time.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Please come back. We'd love to hear more from you. Everybody listening and watching, please find Hope on Twitter. Again, it's SBOnFire. Her podcast is Interchangeable White Ladies. And I don't know if you still blog, Hope. Do you still have your
I do.
website up?
HopeTeague.com. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And go to HopeTeague.com. And you can find her writings also. Thank you all for giving us your morning to talk about education every day. That's just a blessing, because the more we can do for our kids together, the more we can understand these issues.